everyone. As I said initially, I'm the host of this seminar. My name is Jayant Bhandari, and I want to talk very briefly about some of my views about what values underpin successful societies and what values underpin backward, wretched places. Now, for as long as I can remember, I have been obsessed with what makes a society poor and what makes a society rich. What is it behind certain societies that they manage to accumulate wealth, create complex social structures, and create a happy, prosperous society? And what is it about certain societies that they never manage to create a surplus, and when they do manage to create a surplus, either they dissipate it or misuse it for self-destructive purposes? So I want to use works of two people, Jared Diamond and Niall Ferguson, in my conversation here. And I have read with a lot of pleasure books of Jared Diamond, in which he attributes the success of the West to guns, germs, and steel. And Niall Ferguson is very similar. He argues that beginning in the 15th century, the West developed 6 powerful concepts, or what he calls killer applications. What are his killer applications? He says that in the 15th century, West developed competition, science, the rule of law, modern medicine, consumerism, and work ethic. And he says that these applications, these killer applications, were the reason behind why West managed to outpace the East and Africa. So, and I have been going through these kind of literature for a long time, and my question is to Jared Diamond and Niall Ferguson, that these concepts, the concepts of guns and steel, and the 6 killer applications that Niall Ferguson talks about, they have been available to Asia and Africa for at least the last 2 centuries. Why did they fail to catch up? And let's see how did they copy these killer applications and guns and steel. So let's talk about steel. Congo, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone managed to kill millions of people using machetes. Similar was the case in Soviet Russia, and in Cambodia, about 25% of the population was butchered by their own people. Now, in Mao's China, love for steel was so high and so much a cornerstone of their great leap forward that they managed to kill 50 million people in a famine. Now, these people in Africa and in Asia have competed, another killer application, they have competed fiercely for political power. They have expunged their opponents or have sent them to gulags. In Russia, when the state officially reduced its influence on businesses, what you were left with, oligopolies. Now, what about the rule of law? Now, Western people have I think, a wrong understanding about what's been happening in poor countries. I think poor societies have very, very enthusiastically adopted the concept of democracy, the Western legal system, and they're crazy about Western educational system. But mostly, all these things have provided a facade of sophistication over their belief in might is right and tribal instincts. Now let's talk about science. In India, technology has been very effectively used to increase belief in religion and in fairies. Now, when I was growing up in a relatively socialist system, we were shy about discussing astrology. We were shy about telling our friends that we went to temple. Today, that's no longer the case. 40% of Indian scientists believe that God performs miracles. Revisionism has been so outrageous in that country that over the last few years, a large section of the Indian population, particularly the so-called educated, have come to believe that spaceships and ultra-high technology existed in India thousands of years back. In fact, there's a news, if you see in the Indian newspapers these days, there's an archaeologist who believes that aliens used to visit a particular part of India, and they now want cooperation of NASA, and NASA is probably laughing at that. Last year, one of the top headlines in Indian national newspaper was about the archaeological department of India digging up a fort to look for buried gold. The whole country was for gold, precious metals. They were expecting to find a few hundred tons of gold, massive amount of gold in the ground in the fort there. Now, the question is, how did they come to realize that there was likely gold in that area? And why was the nation so focused on what was going to happen? And this is the reason. A godman, a holy man, had a dream in which a king came in his dream and told him that there was gold in that fort. And they dug the fort because of that. What I'm trying to say is that science has been abused. The concept of reason has been mutated into concept of rationalizing whatever is emotionally convenient. Ironically, making a large section of at least the Indian society that I'm closer to very immune to reason and evidence. Now, I'm coming back to another killer application of Niall Ferguson. He talks about consumerism. Now, you only have to visit the high growth parts of Africa and Asia. I thought that when poor societies earned their first money, they would use it for educational and personal development purposes. I was wrong. I was rationally thinking, very irrationally actually. If you look for the data on who is consuming the luxury goods these days and who is consuming the high-end lifestyle, it's the people from the poor societies. The majority of such consumption happens from people of poor societies. Macau today is a much, much bigger sin city than Las Vegas is. I was talking with a company recently. They will have a suite that will go for 135 euros per night. So that's the kind of money that's being spent in that city.
135,000.
135,000 euros per night. Now, of course, this will be ultimate in hedonism, as you can imagine. There will be a private escalator from the lobby to your room. Now, so I was thinking that initially, once they got their money, they would spend on educational purposes. But really, what you see is that a lot of people prefer to share their room with several other people but still prefer to buy iPhones, Louis Vuitton bags, and expensive cars. And you can see that in a lot of places in Asia and Africa. They might be living in very poor neighborhood, but they have expensive cars parked outside. So I come back to my question, and this is not necessarily a challenge to Jared Diamond and Niall Ferguson, but this is my way of developing my views on the subject. Why did guns and steel and the killer applications of Niall Ferguson not achieve their intended results in these poor societies? Why have they so often mutated into something completely opposite and something very corrupt? This is what I think is the root, the foundational reason why the West outpaced the East. I think there are two things. One is that at some point of time, concomitant with is guns and steel and the 6 killer applications, West sometime, somewhere developed two things. One was respect and recognition for the individual. And another was the concept of reason. Without these two things, you can impose democracy on these countries, you can impose any kind of killer applications, they will get corrupted. Now, I think as a result of lack of respect for the individual in the East and lack of respect for the concept and lack of the existence of the concept of reason in a lot of these countries, in my view, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution never really happened outside the West. Even today, it hasn't happened. And in my view, unless these two things get embedded in the culture, you can do whatever you want in terms of technological evolution, you can impose killer applications, they will mutate into something very corrupt. Now, some of you might ask, what about the Arab Spring? What about the protests in Turkey? What about the anti-corruption movement in India? I mean, this has been a massive anti-corruption movement, and the people are euphoric the world over about what's been happening in India as a result. Now, this is my view. I think democracy has been a complete and utter disaster for these poor societies. These were the people who were very prone to herd mentality and tribal instincts. Now, I was in Turkey for a month just before the trouble started happening in Istanbul. Now, when violence erupted in Turkey, it was reported in a Turkish newspaper, Hurriyet Daily News, that the protesters were young, libertarian, and furious. Now, reporting a survey of those at the protests, it said a majority of the protesters who completed the survey, 81.2%, defined themselves as libertarian. 64.5% defined themselves as secular. So I called up a few Turkish friends to inquire about what was actually happening. In the meantime, North American libertarian organizations were going crazy. They were euphoric that Turkey was turning libertarian. There was just one problem. The Turkish newspaper should have translated the original Turkish word into either progressive or leftist, not libertarian. Now, in my view, the Arab Spring had very, very little to do with people trying to seek freedom. These societies are prone to expecting things from other people. Democracy has been marketed to these people as a magic wand. all these people, when they use the word freedom, they are seeking their magic wand of democracy, which can dissolve their pain and responsibility without having to do anything. As you know, this does not add up, and this is going to lead, in my opinion, to a major social chaos in a lot of these countries. The reason why I think democracy has been a disaster for these societies. Now, let's come to the anti-corruption movement in India. Now, everyone I talk to in India wants an end to corruption. They know corruption is a major problem in that country. Every bureaucrat I talk with tells me that they should end corruption. So what's the problem? Why can't they get corruption within a second? Because I don't know many people in that country who will not pay a bribe even when it entails gaining an unfair advantage over other people. They will steal when given a chance. Now, if that's the nature of the society, I promise you, you are irrational if you think they can get rid of corruption. There's no way out for such a society. Now, let me give you a perspective on this thing, and I think I told this story 2 years back in this seminar. My grandmom died about 20 years back, leaving a rather large house with many tenants in that house. Before she died, he took all these God-fearing tenants to a temple to take a pledge that they would vacate their apartments when my mom asked them to leave. It took my mom 15 years to get rid of those people. Not one left voluntarily. So what I was saying was that India's fight for corruption is a facade. This is something they have learned from television. They are acting it out. And I doubt if a lot of people in poor society even conceptualize the concept of corruption the way a rational mind does. Now, what about the West? Socialistic education that discourages self-responsibility has been corrupting and confusing the minds of people here now for several generations, in my view now. Political correctness forces people here not to think critically. And I think the result has been an increasingly irrational minds of people in the West. Strangely, I just saw an article on the Reason's website, one of the latest ones, and it talks about millennials who, the headline says that about 75% or so millennials think government should be small, it's inefficient, all the nice, good things. Except that even a higher percent of those people want higher taxes on rich people, government promising free food and free healthcare for everyone. Really, it doesn't add up. Anyway, my conclusion and the reason of my talk was that you cannot impose the killer applications. You cannot impose democracy or Western-styled legal system or educational system on these countries. You can even try implementing the free market system. And indeed, there are some Austrian economists sitting in this hall. Some of them think that all you need is Ron Paul, an implementation of the free market system, and all would be hunky-dory. But really, in my view, if the individuals in the society are not rational, forget it. It's not going to change. It will only end up with corrupt results. Thank you very much.
Why does Singapore work? Repeat the question, please. Why does Singapore work?
Why does Singapore work? I don't think you can, now standing on the stage like this, I don't think I can form a clear response on this. And social matters are not mathematical matters. Also, people can have a different explanation to why Singapore works. Does dictatorship work better than democracy? My answer is absolutely yes. If you have a benign dictatorship, it's way much better than democracy. Democracy is a complete disaster. For poor societies who cannot think rationally. So maybe dictatorship is the reason why it has worked out so well. Maybe because it's a small island which exploited the fact that they could be a channel for international trade when many other countries around them were untrustworthy, or difficult to trade with. Maybe Singapore was a good trading hub for those for a lot of places in the world. Singapore has indeed attracted a lot of people from outside Singapore, a lot of people who run Singapore are not actually Singaporeans, they are expatriates. So they have created a very good corporate system to run that city. I don't know if I have a clear response to that, but these are some of my quick thoughts. Yes, sir.
You just said it, democracy doesn't work. In fact, it doesn't work for the West. It doesn't work for us either. We're seeing, and they talk about Cicero, apparently was one of the first ones to call democracy for what it was. First of all, democracy is a process, it's not a thing, it's not a product. A country cannot be a democracy. A democracy is a process of choosing by means of a vote. And you can decide who's going to vote. In this room could be only men, only older men, only property. It used to be that way, right? And then you decide how you're going to count the votes. 50% plus one. You know, there are several ways to count the votes, and some are really screwy. Canada is one example. But it's not a thing. It's a process.
Yeah, I have quite often obsessed about why the Western society is so rich and why democracy might seem to work here. Despite that, just about every encounter with a bureaucrat in this country is horrible. But the true reason why this society works is not because of the legal system. A friend of mine was just telling me about the problems he's facing with non-ending court cases in Canadian courts. I think the reason this society works is not because of democracy, not because of the legal system. It works because the guy on the outside still carries the habit of respect for me. He's not going to push me and shovel me when I'm on the street, which would happen in a lot of other countries. He has a habit of respecting me, and there's a concept of reason in this society, which might sound very strange to people who live in people who have been brought up in a system of rationality, but their minds which don't comprehend the concept of reason, and their cultures make them immune to comprehending the concept of reason. Yes, ma'am.
Do you believe that genetics has any part in the sort of traits that we see in different countries and societies? So before reading Jared Diamond and Niall Ferguson, and this is about 30 years back when I was still young, I used to think maybe there was a problem with, there was a racial reason behind it. I don't know. I think there could be some racial reasons, but, and I don't know. I don't have a response to that. I'm not a scientist. I think there should be more research on this thing. But I have also seen that there is something about human beings. There's something, maybe soul is the wrong word, but our humanity overpowers our hardware. And we can make things happen for us if we really want to. And that's where the culture comes in. So I think and this is just my thought, I'm not a scientist, biologist or genetic scientist, but I think even if there were a genetic reason, that should not have much of an influence. The biggest influence is the cultural influence.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
In your search for those two concurrent phenomena you were talking about, did you come across Deirdre McCluskey's work on the bourgeois virtues?
No, I haven't.
Okay, you might find some.
Sure, thank you.
There. Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, we have come to the end of this talk.
Thank you.